So when I was a well site geologist, up in the Canadian foothills, we were running 14,000-foot wells. And as usual, there's always somebody banging on the door saying, when you're going to come up to the conclusion of where the zones are we should perforate or test. Way back then, you would actually have the hard copy of the porosity and the hard copy of the resistivity, and they issued a light box to you, and you'd overlay one on top of the other, and you start to look for prospective zones. And by having the porosity scale this way, it'll mean that the resistivity and the porosity will track more or less when you have nothing but water. So what you're looking for is your prospective zone, just like Jim of Amico was saying. You want your porosity to go this way, meaning great porosity, and you want resistivity to go the other way, saying, hey, whatever's in there doesn't conduct. Now let's see what we see on the overlay. Here's a limestone with 10% porosity, and our expectation is perfect weld, it should read a 10%. They should both do, because it's a limestone with 10%. Those are both on a limestone scale. Dolomite with 10% porosity, same amount of volume, is plotting like so, where the density is reading low and the neutrons reading high. Now the density is the easiest one to understand, because that 0 point right there is fixed on calcite. Limestone with no porosity is the mineral calcite, which has a density of 2.71. So anything that weighs more than 2.71 is going to plot negative. It's not negative error, but just saying, if that's your baseline, 2.71, then if we take dolomite, the mineral, has density about 2.85, an Arbuckle, that's actually going to plot negative space. So the density is reading incorrectly, it's reading too low. The neutron is also reading incorrectly, it's reading too high. And the true volumetric porosity is just about halfway between them. Which is why, for example, you can take the average of the neutron and density that Richard was doing the Arbuckle. That's pretty close to the actual volumetric porosity. Now the sandstone down here, I'll give it 20% porosity. It's the other way around. The density is reading too high and the neutron is reading too low. So again, the real porosity is just about halfway between. Which is another reason why limestone is chosen as kind of the default, because it's kind of the piggy in the middle. It allows you to discriminate one from the other. Now what's going on in the shales? Well, they're reading high gamma ray, 100, 120, something of that sort. The neutron is reading high so-called porosity. But the neutron tool is simply measuring the amount of hydrogen in the formation. It looks in the shale and it sees a lot of hydrogen, clay minerals, bound water, you name it. So it's not effective porosity in terms of what we would like to work with, which is why we correct for shale content when we do log analysis. And the density, well, it's plotting maybe there. And if we converted that back into grams per cc, that's how much that shale would weigh. When you look in a service company logging book, then you'll find listings of all the rock properties, but you say, where are the shales? Well, the shales are going to vary according to the amount of compaction. So if you have shales which are very shallow, poorly compacted, they'll read high neutron, high density porosity. If they're very deep and highly compacted, they'll read rather different values. So you really have to ask the log, what are the shale properties? Well, you look at where the gamma ray says it's shale, and then you read the properties directly. The other thing we have too is the photoelectric factor. And again, that's what Richard talked about. This is also taken out of Schlumberger. Primary scale between 0 and 10 units, bonds per electron. This is clearly something very atomic. Very sensitive to lithology. In fact, here's the relationship then between the photoelectric factor from the log to the atomic number of the elements within the formation. So there's a direct relationship. Otherwise though, in terms of our primary reservoir lithologies, so sandstone, dolomite, limestone, then this is what you expect to see. A little higher than 5, and then a limestone with 30% porosity, that's a lot of porosity, it drags down a bit. And this is containing water. But it does show that it's a very lazy curve when it comes to massive changes in porosity, which when Schlumberger brought it out, they called it the lithodensity tool to signal to you, we got something that can nail lithology. Other companies though, they don't get sued by Schlumberger, they usually call it something like Z density log or Z density log. So if you see the letter Z, then you're seeing something like that. Otherwise, though, we still look at the neutron density, because if we have something here, we say, well, that's a dolomite. Say, maybe not. Could be a sandy limestone. So that's why you need to look at the photoelectric curve in conjunction with the neutron density so you don't get fooled. Down here, and this is also from Schlumberger, they don't talk about shales. You look at the gamma ray log and said there's a shale, where would you expect to see the photoelectric? Somewhere around about here is pretty typical. That's for elliptic shales. If you have kaolinitic shales, then they tend to prop pretty close to quartz, because kaolinite is an aluminosilicate. And if you calculate the number, it comes out close to quartz. Illite, that's also an aluminosilicate, but it has a certain amount of iron content, and that's why you're plotting out there. So in fact, anything that you see in terms of the clay minerals, and particularly if you see anything that starts to really kick in this direction, once you start to clear 7 and it's pulling, going off scale, you have something in formation with a high atomic number. So if you're an optimist, it's gold, it's platinum. If you're a realist, you say it's iron content of some kind. Some kind could be pyrite, could be goethite, hematite, something of that sort. Okay, we just looked at our cartoon. We had a limestone, we had a dolomite, and we had a sandstone. And here we have some real examples. Pennsylvanian ulmotic limestone. We can see the neutron density just tracking very nicely. It's on a limestone scale. We look at the photoelectric curve. Down here, it's pretty tight. 1% porosity maybe. Reading just a little higher than 5, and then it starts to drag down a bit, but it's getting overwhelmed by this amount of porosity there. But it's still a pretty lazy curve, considering there's massive change then in porosity. Dolomite? Well, who knows? The gamma rays kind of wander around a bit, but some of that will be simply the uranium content, because we're looking at the Tawanda, which we saw tends to be a little hot. Photoelectric curve? Well, it's fundamentally dolomite, but it's kind of wandering around a bit. In fact, up here, it's starting to move close to 5. So this is something else to think about, that 5 limestone, but you see anhydrite is also 5. And you think, how can I tell one from the other? Not too difficult, because anhydrite has a density of 2.98. It weighs a lot. So I look at this and I think, okay, that's putting to either a limestone or anhydrite, and I see that actually my density is going negative. So I think, I bet that's a little bit of anhydrite in there. Otherwise, kind of wandering around and saying, yeah, it's mostly a dolomite, but there's other stuff mixed up within it. Finally, the sandstone down below, little gamma ray, it's a chest of sand. Photoelectric curve, really just about 2, dropping down to where it should be, about 1.8. Well, that's picking up a little bit of calcite cement. So any calcite isn't going to drag it back in that direction. And then the overlay of the neutron density here, part of that then is the sandstone effect. Also, there's just a little bit of gas effect in there as well. If you have full-blown gas effect, it really pulls these suckers apart. It just grabs your nose and twists it very violently and says, I'm a gas effect. If you have a small gas effect, though, what you'll see is the so-called hourglass effect, where the neutron goes down and the density goes up. So when you see these things on that way, you think, okay, how much of this is quartz, either as chert or sand, and how much am I seeing as gas effect? Here's the cross plot. And this is the issue then. We've seen that this is our Schlumberger chart that we saw earlier. Neutron porosity in apparent limestone porosity. Density in grams per cc. Density porosity in limestone equivalent units. So that's the way it is. And we say, well, what would happen if we had a zone where, say, the neutron was a reading of 20 and the density was a reading of 10? Those numbers are very different. Which is right? They're both wrong. Let's look on the cross plot and say, okay, 20 and 10. So that looks to my eyes around about here. And I say, what is that? Well, on a cross plot, I interpolate between those lines here and see 10, 10, 10, 15, 15, 20, 20. Okay, let's check the 20, 10. And that's about here. And it looks like about 15.